Sirens wailed in the rearview mirror, shattering the quiet evening. Blue and red lights painted the leather interior of the deep blue Mercedes. Behind the wheel sat a man who had commanded thousands in active war zones, yet tonight his most immediate threat wore a local police badge in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A heavy flashlight tapped sharply against the driver's side window, preceding a barked, hostile command. The distinct scrape of metal against a leather holster echoed in the night air. In a fraction of a second, an ordinary commute morphed into a high-stakes standoff of power, prejudice, and military authority. The patrolman thought he had cornered an easy target. He had just drawn his service weapon on a 4-star nightmare. Lieutenant General David Caldwell was exhausted. At 58, his hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, cropped close to his scalp in regulation style. For the past 48 hours, he had been trapped in a windowless briefing room beneath the Pentagon, overseeing a complex joint forces logistics operation that spanned 3 continents. Tonight, he was finally off the clock. Dressed down in a simple grey cashmere sweater and dark denim jeans, he was looking forward to a quiet evening at his home in Oakwood Hills, an affluent suburb known for its manicured lawns and absolute tranquility. He drove his personal vehicle, a meticulously maintained Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a retirement gift to himself after 35 years of service. He cruised exactly at the speed limit, enjoying the rare silence, listening to a low jazz instrumental. 2 miles behind him, Officer Bradley Hayes sat in his patrol cruiser, nursing a tepid coffee and a foul mood. Hayes was a 5-year veteran of the local force, a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his actual competence. He had a reputation in the precinct for being overly aggressive, a trait his commanding officers had warned him about twice this quarter. Tonight, Hayes was looking for a reason to exert authority, eager to pad his monthly statistics with a high-profile traffic stop. As the sleek Mercedes glided past his hidden position near the county line, Hayes narrowed his eyes. The streetlights illuminated the driver for a brief, fleeting moment. Hayes saw a black man in civilian clothes driving a $100,000 car in a predominantly white, wealthy neighborhood. In Hayes's deeply prejudiced mind, the math didn't add up. Hayes pulled out, accelerating to close the distance. He punched the vehicle's license plate into his onboard computer. The system lagged. Because the vehicle was registered under a highly classified Department of Defense security tier, the local database returned a vague, restricted information/federal hold message, rather than standard registration details. Instead of interpreting this as a sign to proceed with caution, Hayes's heart leapt. He interpreted the restriction as a red flag, perhaps a stolen vehicle with flagged plates, or someone involved in high-level organized crime. He flipped the switches. The light bar ignited, painting the trees in frantic flashes of red and blue. David Caldwell saw the lights instantly. He checked his speedometer. 35 in a 35 zone. He signaled right and pulled over smoothly onto the wide shoulder, placing the car in park. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He had dealt with this specific brand of scrutiny before, though not for several years. He knew the drill. He turned off the engine, turned on the interior dome light, and placed his large, calloused hands flat at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. Hayes stopped his cruiser at an aggressive angle, intentionally blinding the Mercedes's side mirrors with his high beams. He stepped out, unclasping the safety strap on his holster. It was a completely unnecessary show of force for a routine traffic stop. But Hayes wanted to establish dominance immediately. He approached the vehicle cautiously, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into the side mirror, then panning it across the back seat before stopping at the driver's window. David pressed the button to roll the window down, squinting against the harsh glare of the flashlight, beaming directly into his eyes. "Evening, officer," David said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. It was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of fear. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Right now," Hayes barked, entirely ignoring the greeting. He kept the flashlight trained aggressively on David's face. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" David inquired, keeping his hands firmly planted on the steering wheel. "I don't answer questions, you do," Hayes snapped, taking a half-step closer to the door, his posture rigid. "I said license and registration. Are you refusing to comply?" "I am not refusing," David replied evenly, though a cold edge began to form in his tone. "I am simply asking for the legal justification for this stop. My vehicle was maintaining the speed limit, my lights are functional, and my tags are current." "You swerved over the yellow line back by the overpass," Hayes lied smoothly. It was his go-to excuse. "Now, stop stalling and hand over your paperwork before I pull you out of this vehicle for failure to obey a lawful order." David's jaw tightened. He knew he hadn't swerved. He knew exactly what this was. He took a slow, deep breath, reining in the general who was used to giving orders and allowing the civilian to comply with the law. "My wallet is in the center console," David stated clearly, narrating his actions to avoid any misunderstanding. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to move my right hand to open the console." "Move slow," Hayes warned, dropping his right hand to rest on the grip of his service weapon. David slowly lifted his right hand from the wheel, moving it deliberately toward the center console. In the dim light, Hayes's anxiety spiked. The officer was operating on pure adrenaline and prejudice, a dangerous cocktail that completely overrode his tactical training. He watched the large man in the driver's seat shift his weight slightly to reach the console latch. "I said move slow," Hayes shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "I am moving slowly, officer," David replied, his patience wearing thin. He popped the console open. Inside lay his leather wallet, holding his civilian driver's license, credit cards, and his military common access card, CAC. As David reached his fingers into the console to grasp the wallet, a shadow crossed his arm. Hayes, misinterpreting the depth of the console and the shadow as a concealed weapon compartment, panicked. "Show me your hands! Show me your hands right now!" Hayes screamed, taking a step back. The metallic shuck of a handgun clearing a Kydex holster cut through the night. David froze. He didn't turn his head, but his peripheral vision caught the dull gleam of the barrel pointed directly at his temple through the open window. Time seemed to slow down. For David Caldwell, a man who had survived ambushes in Fallujah and mortar fire in the Korangal Valley, the sight of a weapon was not alien, but the context was violently jarring. He was 2 miles from his home. He was unarmed, and the man holding the gun was shaking. "Officer," David said. The volume of his voice did not rise, but the tenor of it shifted dramatically. It was no longer the polite tone of a civilian. It was the command voice of a 3-star general. It carried the absolute, unyielding weight of authority. "Take your finger off the trigger. You are making a monumental mistake." "Shut up! Hands out the window! Do it now, or I will shoot you!" Hayes was hyperventilating, his arms trembling as he held the Glock 19 aimed at David's head. The situation had completely spiraled out of his control, driven entirely by his own manufactured terror. David knew that sudden movements around a panicked, poorly trained man with a firearm were a death sentence. He slowly, agonizingly slowly, raised his empty hands, keeping his palms open and facing the officer. He moved them toward the window, eventually resting his wrists on the doorframe. "My hands are visible," David said, his voice chillingly calm. "I am unarmed. You pulled me over for a phantom traffic violation. You have drawn your service weapon on an unarmed citizen. I strongly suggest you reevaluate your next move, son." "Don't you call me son," Hayes yelled, keying the radio on his shoulder with his free hand. "Dispatch, I need backup. Suspect is uncooperative. Possible weapon in the vehicle. Oakwood and 4th. "Copy, Unit 3. Backup is 1 minute out." David remained completely motionless. He studied Hayes's face. The officer was sweating profusely, his eyes wide. He was a frightened animal with a lethal tool. "When your backup arrives," David said, his gaze locked forward, ignoring the barrel of the gun inches from his face, "you are going to request your watch commander to this location immediately." "You don't give the orders here," Hayes spit back, though the unwavering composure of the man in the car was beginning to unnerve him. Suspects usually cried, panicked, or begged. This man was talking to him as if he were a disobedient recruit. In the distance, the wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Tires screeched as a second patrol car careened around the corner, its headlights illuminating the tense standoff. Officer Lewis Ford practically leaped from the backup cruiser before it was fully in park. Ford was a 20-year veteran of the force, a community policing advocate who had grown deeply tired of cleaning up Bradley Hayes's messes. He drew his own weapon at the low ready as he ran toward the scene, assessing the situation. He saw Hayes standing rigidly, gun pointed point-blank into the driver's side window of a luxury sedan. "Hayes, report!" Ford barked, approaching from the rear quarter panel of the Mercedes to get a clear line of sight on the driver. "He was reaching, Ford. He was reaching into the console," Hayes yelled back, not taking his eyes off David. Ford moved closer, flashlight illuminating the interior. He saw a man with his hands resting calmly on the window frame. He didn't see a weapon. He didn't see panic. He saw a man radiating intense, dangerous composure. "Sir, do you have a weapon in the vehicle?" Ford asked, his tone firm but professional, unlike Hayes's hysterical shouting. "I do not," David replied, turning his head slightly to address the older officer. "My name is David Caldwell. My wallet is currently sitting on the edge of the open center console. Your partner escalated a routine, unjustified traffic stop and drew his weapon when I attempted to retrieve the identification he demanded." Ford looked at the driver. He recognized the bearing. It was the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime in uniform. "Hayes, lower your weapon," Ford ordered, stepping closer. "He was reaching. I said lower your weapon, Bradley," Ford snapped, recognizing the lack of immediate threat. "Keep it at the ready if you have to, but get it out of his face." Reluctantly, his hand still shaking, Hayes lowered the gun slightly, though he did not holster it. "Mr. Caldwell," Ford said, approaching the window cautiously, "I'm going to reach into the vehicle and retrieve your wallet from the console. Is that understood?" "Proceed," David said, keeping his hands outside the window. Ford reached past David, his eyes scanning the console. He saw the black leather wallet sitting exactly where the driver had said it was. No hidden compartments, no gleam of a gun barrel. Just a wallet. Ford pulled it out and stepped back into the space between the two vehicles, flipping the wallet open under the beam of his flashlight. He expected to see a standard state driver's license. Instead, his light caught the distinct, holographic sheen of a United States Department of Defense identification card. Ford squinted, reading the text. Name, Caldwell, David A. Rank, Lieutenant General, Lieutenant General. Branch, United States Army. Status, active duty. Beneath that, Ford saw the unmistakable insignia of 3 stars, and beneath that, a high-level clearance designation that Ford recognized from his own brief stint in the military police years ago. Ford's breath caught in his throat. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He looked from the ID card to the man sitting in the car, and then slowly over to Officer Hayes, who was still gripping his pistol, completely oblivious to the magnitude of the mistake he had just made. Ford snapped his wallet shut and walked over to Hayes. Without a word, he grabbed Hayes's wrist and physically forced the younger officer's arm down. "Holster your weapon, right now!" Ford hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and dread. "What? Ford, holster your damn weapon, Hayes, before you ruin both our lives!" Ford practically growled. Stunned by the older officer's aggression, Hayes finally slid the Glock back into its holster, clicking the retention strap into place. Ford walked back to the driver's window. His entire demeanor had changed. He stood at attention. "General Caldwell, sir." "I apologize for the situation," Ford said, his voice respectful and tightly controlled. "I am Officer Ford." Hayes, standing a few feet away, froze. The word "general" echoed in his ears. The blood drained entirely from his face. He felt the pavement swaying beneath his boots. David slowly lowered his hands from the window frame, pulling them back into the car. He turned his head to look directly at Ford, and then at the pale, wide-eyed Hayes. "Officer Ford," David said, his voice ringing out clearly in the quiet street. "You will contact your precinct immediately. You will tell your watch commander, your shift supervisor, and whoever else is in charge of your internal affairs division to meet me at this exact intersection. I am not moving this vehicle until they arrive." "Yes, General. Immediately," Ford said. He didn't argue. He knew exactly how disastrous this was for the department. "And Officer Hayes," David called out, his gaze locking onto the younger cop, who looked as though he might be sick right there on the asphalt. Hayes swallowed hard, unable to find his voice. "You," David said softly, the quiet tone carrying more menace than a shout ever could, "have just made the biggest mistake of your professional life." For 20 agonizing minutes, the intersection of Oakwood and 4th remained an island of tension under the harsh glare of police strobes. Officer Bradley Hayes stood near the trunk of his cruiser, his hands resting on his duty belt, his stomach twisting into tight, nauseating knots. He tried to project defiance, but his knees felt like water. He kept glancing at the dark silhouette of the man sitting patiently in the Mercedes. Officer Lewis Ford stood a few yards away, effectively running interference between Hayes and the general. Ford had already secured the scene, ordering 2 more responding units to block the street and keep curious neighbors at a distance. He had also immediately radioed dispatch to explicitly request the watch commander and the on-call internal affairs investigator, bypassing standard protocol. He knew a localized nuclear detonation was about to happen within his department, and he wanted to be as far outside the blast radius as possible. Finally, a black, unmarked Ford Explorer broke through the perimeter, its hidden grille lights flashing a frantic red and white. It screeched to a halt, and Captain Robert Stanton stepped out. Stanton was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, his uniform slightly rumpled from being hastily thrown on over his off-duty clothes. He looked annoyed, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he marched toward Ford. "Ford, what in God's name is going on here?" Stanton barked, his voice carrying over the idle of the engines. "Dispatch said you called a code 4 on a traffic stop, but then demanded me and IA. Who the hell are we holding up?" Ford didn't say a word. He simply handed Stanton the leather wallet he had been holding on to like a live grenade. Stanton snatched it, shining his penlight onto the open ID card. The captain's annoyance vanished, replaced instantly by a chilling, hollow shock. He stared at the 3 stars. He stared at the Department of Defense clearance codes. He looked up at Ford, the blood completely draining from his face. "Tell me," Stanton whispered, his voice suddenly very hoarse. "Tell me Hayes didn't do what I think he did." He pulled his service weapon on him. "Captain," Ford replied quietly, shaking his head. Point blank through the window. Unprovoked, The general was reaching for this exact ID after Hayes demanded it. I arrived to find Hayes aiming at his head, screaming at him. Stanton closed his eyes, inhaling a sharp, ragged breath. He knew Bradley Hayes was a liability, a hothead with a subtle but documented history of racially biased stops in affluent neighborhoods. But this was a catastrophic failure that could bring the Department of Justice down on their precinct by morning. Just then, another sedan pulled up. Lieutenant Gregory Mitchell, the head of Internal Affairs, stepped out, carrying a heavy metal clipboard. He took one look at Stanton's face and knew this was not a drill. Stanton took a deep breath, adjusted his duty belt, and walked toward the driver's side of the Mercedes. Ford and Mitchell trailed closely behind him. Hayes tried to follow, but Ford shot him a glare so venomous it rooted the young officer to the asphalt. "General Caldwell," Stanton said, stopping a respectful 3 feet from the window. His tone was deferential, entirely stripped of its usual gruff authority. "I am Captain Robert Stanton, watch commander for this district. I have Lieutenant Mitchell from Internal Affairs with me." The door of the Mercedes unlatched. "Step back, Captain," David said, his voice calm but layered with absolute command. Stanton, Mitchell, and Ford instinctively took a step back. David Caldwell stepped out of the vehicle. He smoothed his grey cashmere sweater and stood to his full height of 6'3". In the flashing lights, he didn't look like a civilian who had just been terrorized. He looked like a battlefield commander surveying a ruined landscape. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. His profound stillness was far more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. "Captain Stanton," David began, his eyes locking onto the older man. "At 2100 hours and 15 minutes, your officer initiated a traffic stop on my vehicle. I was driving precisely at the posted speed limit. I committed no moving violations. When I asked for the justification of the stop, I was met with hostility and a fabricated claim of crossing the center line." David paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the cool night air. When I attempted to comply with his demand for identification, narrating my movements to ensure transparency, he panicked. He unholstered his firearm, pointed it at my temple, and threatened my life. Had I possessed the nervous system of an untrained civilian, had I flinched, or had I panicked in response to his screaming, your officer would have murdered me in the street. "Sir, Stanton started, but the general simply raised a hand, cutting him off completely. "You will secure his body camera footage immediately, Captain. You will not view it. You will not copy it. Lieutenant Mitchell will take possession of it right now," David instructed, turning his piercing gaze to the IA officer. "Is that understood, Lieutenant?" "Yes, General," Mitchell responded instantly, frantically writing on his clipboard. "I have spent 35 years defending the Constitution of this nation," David continued, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a cold, controlled fury. "I have buried men and women who died protecting the liberties of citizens they never met. And yet, I return to my own neighborhood, only to have a man in a uniform paid for by the very citizens he has sworn to protect, decide that my life is forfeit because my skin color does not match his expectations of this zip code." Stanton swallowed hard. "General Caldwell, on behalf of this department, I offer my deepest apologies. I assure you, this will be handled with the utmost severity." "Apologies are for spilled coffee, Captain," David replied. "What I require is accountability. I know your chief, William Russo. We sat on a joint federal security task force 3 years ago. You will call him tonight. You will inform him that I am filing a formal complaint, not only for aggravated assault and excessive use of force, but for a direct violation of my civil rights under Title 18, Section 242. The reality of David's words hit the officers like physical blows. Title 18, Section 242, was the federal statute for deprivation of rights under color of law. The general wasn't just threatening a slap on the wrist or administrative leave. He was invoking the FBI. He was threatening federal prison. Stanton turned to Mitchell. The silent communication between the two veterans was clear. Cut the infection out now, before it kills the whole host. Stanton walked over to where Bradley Hayes was standing. Hayes was trembling visibly now. The arrogance that had fueled him 20 minutes prior had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out bully. "Captain, I swear, he reached down fast," Hayes stammered, his voice pleading. "The console was dark. I couldn't see his hands, I thought." "Shut your mouth, Hayes," Stanton growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped within inches of the younger officer's face. "You thought you found an easy mark? You thought you could throw your weight around? Ford told me everything. He told me the general was completely calm, hands visible, offering zero resistance." "He's lying! Ford's throwing me under the bus," Hayes squeaked, desperation making his voice crack. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Stanton called out, not taking his eyes off Hayes. Mitchell walked over, his face grim. "Officer Hayes," Mitchell said, reciting the protocol with practiced, emotionless efficiency. "You are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending a full internal and criminal investigation. Turn around and place your hands on the trunk of your cruiser." "What? Captain, please!" Hayes begged, tears of pure panic springing to his eyes. "You can't do this. I'm a cop. You're a liability," Stanton spat. "Turn around." Sobbing openly now, a humiliating sound that echoed off the quiet suburban houses, Hayes turned and placed his hands on the cold metal of his car. "Give me your weapon," Mitchell ordered. With shaking hands, Hayes unclipped his holster. Mitchell took the Glock 19, the same gun that had been pointed at the general's head, and cleared the chamber, dropping the magazine into his evidence bag. "Your badge, your radio, and your body camera," Mitchell continued relentlessly. Right there on the street, under the unforgiving glare of the floodlights and the unblinking stare of a 3-star general, Bradley Hayes was dismantled. He was stripped of the metal and plastic that gave him his power. When Mitchell was finished, Hayes was just a frightened man in a cheap polyester shirt. Stanton walked back over to David Caldwell. "Sir," Stanton said, his tone heavy. "Officer Hayes has been disarmed and suspended. He will be transported back to the precinct in the back of Lieutenant Mitchell's vehicle, not his own. The criminal investigation begins the second we walk through those doors. Chief Russo will be calling you by 800 hours tomorrow." David looked past Stanton, his eyes resting on the pathetic figure of Hayes, who was now handcuffed. Department policy for a disarmed officer under criminal suspicion being transported by IA and being guided into the back of Mitchell's unmarked car. There was no pity in David's eyes. True justice did not allow for pity when authority was so violently abused. "See that he does, Captain," David said. He extended his hand. Stanton took it, noting the iron-firm grip of the older man. "And Captain Stanton, commend Officer Ford. His situational awareness and de-escalation likely saved your department from a national tragedy tonight." "I will, General. Have a safe rest of your night, sir." David offered a crisp, single nod. He turned, got back into his Mercedes, and started the engine. The low jazz instrumental resumed, a surreal contrast to the flashing lights outside. He put the car in drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ruins of Bradley Hayes's life in his rearview mirror. As the taillights of the Mercedes disappeared around the bend, Stanton let out a long, exhausted breath. He looked at Ford, who was staring at the ground, shaking his head. "Ford," Stanton said quietly, "write the report exactly as it happened. Leave nothing out. Do not try to soften it for him." "I wouldn't dream of it, Cap," Ford replied. The immediate fallout was swift and brutal, but it was only the beginning. Bradley Hayes sat in the back of the IA vehicle, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He stared out the window at the passing trees, his mind racing through the consequences. He had lost his job. He was going to lose his pension. But as the days unfolded, Hayes would learn that karma, when delivered by a man who moved armies, did not stop at a simple firing. The next morning, General Caldwell didn't just wait for the chief's phone call. He made 3 phone calls of his own. One to the local district attorney, one to the regional director of the FBI, and one to a very old friend who currently served as an assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Bradley Hayes had pulled a gun to feel powerful. Instead, he had awakened a sleeping giant, and the system he had abused was about to crush him flat. At exactly 800 hours the following morning, the atmosphere inside the Oakwood Police Department's executive suite was toxic with dread. Chief William Russo, a pragmatic man who had spent 30 years building a reputable department, sat behind his heavy oak desk, his face buried in his hands. Sitting across from him were Captain Robert Stanton, Lieutenant Gregory Mitchell from Internal Affairs, and Catherine Croft, the formidable district attorney for the county. The room was deathly silent, save for the clicking of a computer mouse. Mitchell had just played the raw, unedited body camera footage from Bradley Hayes's vest. The video had captured it all with terrifying clarity. It showed the general's calm compliance, the polite narration of his movements, and then the sudden, hysterical escalation by Hayes. The metallic shh of the Glock being drawn echoed in the quiet office, followed by Hayes's unhinged screaming. They watched the barrel of the gun shake uncontrollably, pointed directly at the head of a man who possessed the highest security clearances in the United States government. "Mother of God," Russo whispered, finally looking up. His face was the color of ash. He almost executed a 3-star general over a phantom traffic violation. "It gets worse, Chief," Croft said, her voice sharp and clinical. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes narrowing at the frozen frame of Hayes's weapon. "I received a phone call at 6:30 this morning. It wasn't from Captain Stanton. It was from the United States Attorney's Office. General Caldwell didn't just file a local complaint. He activated his network." Before Russo could respond, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open. The department's receptionist, looking entirely overwhelmed, stepped aside to allow 3 men in dark suits to enter the room. The lead man, flashing a gold shield, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Chief Russo, Special Agent Thomas Gentry, FBI Civil Rights Division. I believe you're expecting us." Russo stood slowly. "Agent Gentry, we are initiating our internal—" "You are initiating an internal investigation, Chief," Gentry interrupted smoothly, dropping a thick manila folder onto Russo's desk. "As of 700 hours, under the authority of the Department of Justice, the FBI is assuming primary jurisdiction over this incident. We are opening a criminal probe into Officer Bradley Hayes for deprivation of rights under color of law. Title 18, Section 242. We will also be auditing your department's traffic stop data for the past 36 months to establish any patterns of racially motivated policing." Stanton swallowed hard. A DOJ audit was the death knell for a police chief's career. The karma General Caldwell had promised was not a localized strike. It was a carpet bombing of the entire corrupt ecosystem that had allowed a man like Hayes to wear a badge. Downstairs, completely oblivious to the federal storm gathering above him, Bradley Hayes sat in a windowless interview room. He had been stripped of his uniform the night before and was now wearing civilian clothes, nervously bouncing his knee against the metal table. The door opened, and Greg Foley, the senior representative for the police union, walked in. Foley was a bulldog of a man who had successfully defended dozens of cops from excessive force charges. Hayes let out a massive sigh of relief. "Greg, thank God!" Hayes rushed out, leaning forward. "They took my badge. You got to talk to Stanton. The guy reached into his console. It was dark. I had a split second to make a decision. The union has to back me on this." Foley didn't sit down. He didn't open his briefcase. He just stared at Hayes with a mixture of disgust and profound pity. "I just came from Chief Russo's office, Bradley," Foley said, his voice completely devoid of its usual bluster. "I watched the footage. The FBI is upstairs right now. They've seized the hard drives." Hayes stopped bouncing his knee. The FBI? "You didn't just pull a gun on an unarmed black man in a nice car, Bradley," Foley said, leaning over the table, his knuckles white. "You pulled a gun on Lieutenant General David Caldwell. The man oversees global logistics for the Joint Chiefs. He is personal friends with the Attorney General, and the video shows you threatening to blow his brains out while his hands were completely visible. But the Union, there is no Union protection for what you did," Foley cut him off coldly. "You violated core policy, you violated federal law, and you lied on your initial verbal report to Captain Stanton. The Fraternal Order is officially severing your legal representation. You are entirely on your own." Foley turned and walked toward the door. "Wait! Greg! You can't leave me here!" Hayes screamed, true, unadulterated panic setting in. Foley paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "They aren't just firing you, Bradley. The feds are drafting the arrest warrant right now. You better call a private lawyer, a very, very expensive one." When the door clicked shut, the silence of the room crushed in on Hayes. The absolute power he had felt gripping that Glock the night before was gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that his life, as he knew it, was over. The 7 months following the incident at the intersection of Oakwood and 4th were a masterclass in systematic destruction. The karma that General David Caldwell had set into motion was not a swift, emotional act of revenge. It was the cold, grinding, inescapable machinery of the federal justice system. The Oakwood Police Department was torn apart down to its studs. The Department of Justice, acting on the explosive body camera footage and the general's formal complaint, descended upon the affluent suburb with an army of civil rights investigators. Chief William Russo, desperate to save his own pension, fully cooperated, turning over a decade of traffic stop data, internal communications, and disciplinary records. What the FBI found was a quiet, insidious pattern of racial profiling, unofficial quotas targeting minorities driving through the wealthy zip codes. Captain Robert Stanton was forced into early, disgraced retirement. 3 other officers were suspended. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree, mandating sweeping overhauls, civilian oversight, and rigorous de-escalation training, spearheaded by newly promoted Sergeant Lewis Ford. But the full, crushing weight of this reckoning fell squarely on the shoulders of Bradley Hayes. His life evaporated with terrifying speed. Following his immediate termination, the police union officially abandoned him, citing his gross violation of departmental policy and the indefensible nature of the video evidence. Without union backing, Hayes was forced to hire a private defense attorney, a ruthless ex-prosecutor named Daniel Harrington, whose retainer fee instantly wiped out Hayes's life savings and forced him into crushing debt. Hayes became a pariah. His former brothers in blue stopped returning his calls, treating him like an infection that could jeopardize their own careers. He couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized from the relentless media coverage. The Oakwood General case had become a national flashpoint, a textbook example of unchecked authority colliding with absolute, unyielding competence. Hayes had initially begged his lawyer to fight the charges, clinging to his fabricated story that the general had made a sudden movement. But Harrington had simply set his laptop on the table, hit play on the raw body camera footage, and let the truth silence his client. "You don't fight this, Bradley," Harrington had told him coldly, watching the on-screen Hayes scream at a perfectly still, perfectly calm General Caldwell. "If I put you in front of a jury with this video, they won't just convict you, they will crucify you. The DOJ is offering a plea agreement. Title 18, USC, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. You take the plea, or you risk 20 years. Broken, broke, and terrified, Bradley Hayes signed the paperwork. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a bleak, overcast Tuesday in mid-May. The federal courthouse in downtown stood as an imposing, brutalist monolith of grey limestone and blast-proof glass. Outside, a sea of news vans, satellite trucks, and reporters formed a gauntlet. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note beneath the heavy scent of polished mahogany and floor wax. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Federal marshals stood at every door, their eyes scanning the crowd. Bradley Hayes sat at the defense table, looking like a ghost of the arrogant cop who had patrolled Oakwood Hills. He had lost nearly 30 pounds. His cheekbones jutted out sharply, and his once immaculate haircut was unkempt. His tailored suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. He stared blankly at the legal pads in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. Across the aisle, sitting in the front row of the gallery, was General David Caldwell. The contrast was staggering. Caldwell wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit with a subtle crimson tie. His posture was immaculate, radiating the quiet, devastating command of a man who had orchestrated wars and moved fleets across oceans. He did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He looked entirely undisturbed, a mountain observing a storm it had already weathered. Beside him sat Sergeant Lewis Ford, subpoenaed to provide context to the events of that night, wearing his dress uniform. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The Honorable Judge Richard Sullivan emerged from chambers, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat at the elevated bench. Sullivan was a veteran jurist, known for his razor-sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for corruption. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at the defense table with an expression of profound distaste. "Be seated," Judge Sullivan commanded. He opened the thick presentence investigation report on his desk. "We are here today for the sentencing of United States versus Bradley Hayes. The defendant has pleaded guilty to one count of violating Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. Mr. Pierce, for the government, are you ready to proceed?" Assistant United States Attorney Jonathan Pierce stood up. "We are, Your Honor." "Does the government wish to be heard before the court imposes its sentence?" "Briefly, Your Honor," Pierce said, stepping up to the podium. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. On the night in question, the defendant, operating under the authority of his badge, initiated a traffic stop based entirely on implicit bias. When the victim, a decorated military officer, calmly asked for the legal justification of the stop and attempted to provide his identification, the defendant escalated the encounter to the point of lethal threat. He drew his service weapon, aimed it directly at the victim's head, and threatened to execute him. He did this while the victim's hands were empty and completely visible. Pierce paused, letting the severity of the words hang in the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, The body camera footage, which is part of the official record, shows a law enforcement officer who was not acting out of fear for his life, but out of a desperate, furious need to exert absolute dominance over a citizen he felt had no right to question him. The government recommends a sentence at the absolute top of the federal guidelines. Furthermore, the victim has requested to address the court prior to sentencing. Judge Sullivan nodded slowly. The court grants the request. General Caldwell, you may step forward. David Caldwell stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with a precise, practiced motion and walked down the center aisle. He did not look at Bradley Hayes. He walked with the heavy, measured steps of a man entirely comfortable with the weight of consequence. He stepped up to the podium, placing his large hands on the wooden edges. When he spoke, his deep baritone voice effortlessly filled the large courtroom, requiring no microphone. "Your Honor," David began, his tone respectful, but layered with an undeniable authority. "For 35 years, I have had the profound privilege of wearing the uniform of the United States Army. I have deployed to active combat zones across the globe. I have led thousands of men and women into environments where the threat of death was a daily, tangible reality. In those theaters of war, we operate under strict rules of engagement. We are trained to identify legitimate threats, to maintain our bearing under catastrophic pressure, and to use lethal force only when absolutely necessary to preserve life." David turned slightly, his eyes sweeping across the gallery before settling on the judge. "The uniform I wore demanded discipline. It demanded that I judge a situation not by my own anxieties, but by the objective facts on the ground. But on the night of October 14th, in a quiet suburb less than 2 miles from my own home, I was reminded that there are men who wear a different uniform, men who are armed by the state, who possess none of that discipline." At the defense table, Bradley Hayes squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped, cutting a track down his pale cheek. When Mr. Hayes activated his lights, I was not speeding. I was not driving erratically. I was simply a black man driving a luxury vehicle in a neighborhood where Mr. Hayes decided I did not belong. To him, my presence was an anomaly that required investigation. And when I did not immediately cower, when I calmly exercised my rights as a citizen to ask why I was being detained, his fragile ego shattered. David's voice dropped an octave, the cold, controlled fury finally bleeding into his words. It was a terrifying sound. He pulled his service weapon. He pointed it point blank at my temple. I heard the mechanical scrape of the slide. I saw his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. I saw the absolute, unhinged panic in his eyes. He was screaming at me. He was terrorizing me. He wanted me to make a mistake. He wanted me to flinch, to drop my hands, to give him the microscopic shred of justification he needed to end my life on that asphalt. The courtroom was entirely paralyzed. The silence was so absolute that the scratching of the court reporter's stenotype machine sounded like rapid gunfire. "Your Honor, I survived that night because I have spent a lifetime training my central nervous system not to panic when a weapon is drawn on me. I survived because I knew exactly how to manage a hostile, poorly trained combatant. I had to de-escalate the man who was paid to protect me." David finally turned his head. He looked directly at Bradley Hayes. The former officer shrank under the gaze, his shoulders hunching forward as if physically struck. "I'm standing here today," David continued, never breaking eye contact with Hayes, "because I have 3 stars on my shoulder. I am standing here because I have the resources to hold the system accountable. But my thoughts are not with Mr. Hayes. My thoughts are with the 19-year-old kid coming home from a late shift. My thoughts are with the single father who might reach for his wallet a fraction of a second too quickly. My thoughts are with the citizens who do not possess decades of tactical training. If Mr. Hayes had pulled over a civilian who reacted with normal, human fear to a gun being shoved in their face, we would not be here for a sentencing hearing. We would be reading an autopsy report. David turned back to Judge Sullivan. The badge is a sacred covenant between the government and the governed. It is a symbol of trust. When a man uses that badge as a shield to terrorize the public, he fractures the very foundation of our civil society. I do not ask for vengeance, Your Honor. I ask for a sentence that sends an unequivocal message that the law applies equally to those who enforce it, and that those who abuse their authority will face the absolute, unyielding wrath of the justice system. David Caldwell gave a crisp, formal nod to the judge, turned, and walked back to his seat. He sat down, unbuttoning his jacket, his demeanor instantly returning to calm neutrality. Judge Sullivan sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were locked onto Bradley Hayes with burning intensity. "Mr. Hayes, stand up," the judge ordered. Hayes pushed himself up from the chair on shaking legs. His lawyer, Harrington, stood beside him, a stony expression on his face. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years, Judge Sullivan began, his voice ringing with absolute disdain. "I have sentenced cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and violent offenders. But cases involving the abuse of law enforcement authority offend the conscience of this court in a profoundly unique way. You were given a gun, a badge, and the power to deprive citizens of their liberty. In exchange, society asked only that you exercise that power with judgment, fairness, and restraint." The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You failed completely. You allowed your racial bias and your petty need for dominance to override your training, your duty, and your basic humanity. You manufactured a crisis, and then you used a deadly weapon to threaten the life of a man who was fully complying with your unlawful orders. As General Caldwell so eloquently stated, it is a miracle, born of his discipline, not yours, that you are not standing before me facing a murder charge." Judge Sullivan picked up his wooden gavel. "Your actions have disgraced your department, compromised the safety of your community, and eroded the public trust. It is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Bradley Hayes, is hereby committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be imprisoned for a term of 60 months. This sentence will be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently and irrevocably barred from holding any position in law enforcement, security, or any role requiring the carrying of a firearm at the local, state, or federal level." The judge paused, letting the devastating reality of 5 years in federal lockup sink in. "You are remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals immediately. Court is adjourned." Bang! The gavel strike echoed like a gunshot. Instantly, 2 heavy-set United States Marshals moved in behind the defense table. "Hands behind your back," one of the marshals instructed, his voice devoid of any emotion. Bradley Hayes offered no resistance. He numbly placed his hands behind his back. The loud, metallic ratcheting of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the final, definitive sound of his ruined life. There was no professional courtesy. There was no union representative to save him. He was just another federal inmate. As the marshals turned him to lead him toward the side door that led to the holding cells, Hayes stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked across the courtroom, past the barrier, directly at the gallery. He saw General David Caldwell standing up, shaking hands warmly with Sergeant Lewis Ford. Caldwell looked entirely at peace. He did not look in Hayes's direction. To the general, Hayes was no longer a threat, no longer an officer, and no longer relevant. He was simply a tactical error that had been decisively corrected. "Keep moving," the marshal grunted, giving Hayes a firm shove between the shoulder blades. Bradley Hayes stumbled forward, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a dull thud, sealing him away from the world he once thought he ruled. The karma had come full circle, precise, ruthless, and absolute. The incident at Oakwood and Fourth became a watershed moment for law enforcement accountability. It underscored a chilling reality. Prejudice does not pause to check a resume, and unwarranted aggression can shatter a life in a fraction of a second. Bradley Hayes sought to assert dominance based on a toxic, preconceived bias, completely unaware that he was attempting to intimidate a man forged in the fires of global conflict. General Caldwell's calculated, devastating response dismantled not only a corrupt officer, but forced a systemic overhaul of an entire precinct. It proved that true justice requires both courage and leverage. Today, David Caldwell drives his neighborhood streets in peace, a testament to unyielding composure. Meanwhile, miles away in a federal facility, Bradley Hayes sits in a cell, left with nothing but the haunting memory of the night he pulled a gun on the wrong man and lost everything.